I was addicted to Kratom for 3 years, and in this video, I'm going to share my story with you. Hi, my name is Becca, and I have been Kratom free for 4 years. It has been a long journey getting through that whole process of addiction and recovery, and on this channel, we talk about that. So, how it all started for me was, and this was many years ago now because I've been off of Kratom for 4 years and I was addicted to Kratom for 3. So that's a total of 7 years, and that's a long time. So leading up to the time when I started, Kratom just slowly but surely started crossing my path as far as like coming into my awareness because I had no idea what it was at first. And the first time that I ever saw the word kratom was on a forum called Arrowhead, it's kind of like a database of people's experiences with different substances. And I saw somebody's experience with kratom, and I remember it kind of like piqued my interest a little bit, where the person was talking about its euphoric effects, and it started to kind of just like register in my brain as to like what is this stuff and what it's about. And then moving forward, it just whatever faded into the ether. I didn't pay too much mind to what it was or seeking it out. But I began studying herbalism probably 8-9 years ago. And as I was studying herbalism, I then heard about it again. And I have a chronic pain condition that also was really tough at that time. And when it really crossed my path and I actually paid attention to it was during that time. And so I was dealing with this chronic pain thing, and I was studying herbalism, and that's when Kratom crossed my path and I started to become interested in it. And so to begin with, just to give you a little bit of a backstory, I have been sober from alcohol for 14 years. And at that time, I had been I had quit drinking for, I don't even know what the math is on that, like 6-7 years or something. And when I quit drinking, I went through this, like, how do I even describe it? Kind of this like weird hippie mission where I was like, I don't want to put anything unnatural into my body. If it's going to go into my body, it's going to be from unprocessed plant sources. And so at that time, again, I was dealing with this chronic pain thing, and I wouldn't take even as much as a Tylenol. Like when I quit the drinking, I quit taking any sort of anything over the counter medications, pain relievers, cold medicines, anything. If it wasn't a plant and it wasn't unprocessed, I wouldn't consume it. So, needless to say, I was suffering through this pain condition. And my lifestyle at the time was very stressful. I was not taking the best care of myself through diet and, the stress of my life at that time. And so when the kratom then crossed my path again, and it was in relationship to it being used for pain management, I really started to it really caught my attention. And then I started to research it because I wasn't just going to haphazardly get this stuff and start taking it. And at that time, so it was like 7 years ago, which is, going on almost 10 years ago, if you generalize things. At that time, the information that was on the surface level of my kratom research painted it in this light that it was this miraculous, legal herbal supplement that was no more addictive than coffee, that did no harm, and that it to me seemed like this answer to like every ailment that I could ever have or that I had at the time. And so I started researching by just, doing general searches as to what kratom was and what, its properties were and what it treated. And I came across a lot of pro kratom information and people just like hyping this stuff up. And I watched a lot of YouTube videos on like Psyched Substances, which is a YouTube channel that's since really blown up, on his channel, on a lot of other channels. At that time, it had been talked about on the Joe Rogan podcast. At that time, what's his name? Lance Armstrong. Is that the right, or is that the astronaut? Whoever the Live Strong guy is, the athlete is, he was pro kratom too. So I'm like seeing all these people and I'm like, okay, if all these people are saying that kratom is cool and it's no more addictive than coffee. I used to be a huge coffee lover. And I'm on this weird hippie mission that I'm not even going to take a Tylenol when I'm, basically debilitated in pain. Hey, this sounds great. It's this leaf from Southeast Asia that's just ground up into a powder, and this sounds great. I don't have much experience with opiates, okay? I have taken opiates for when I had my wisdom teeth pulled like 20 years ago. I grew up in the whole like opiate epidemic that went on where like there was just this free flow of pharmaceutical opiates all around me. And I have a lot of people in my life who are opiate addicts, a lot of people that I've loved who were at that time opiate addicts or who are still opiate addicts today. So for me, from a very young age, I was not interested in opiates. I saw them as very dangerous. And I also, through the 90s and stuff where there was like all of these opiate pharmaceuticals everywhere, they just never really like caught my attention. And the times that I did try them, I was like, okay, whatever. Like I didn't ever really feel anything from them, to be honest with you. And the time that I took them for my wisdom teeth, they just like kind of made me feel sick. So I don't really have any experience with opiates except for the people that were in my life who were taking them and seeing the destruction that they had on these people's lives, and thus in turn the destruction that was brought into my life because of them. So the whole like kratom and opiate connection never really registered to me. And I knew that it was similar to opiates, but in my mind, I'm like, okay, whatever. It's a leaf that from a tree. I'm a, old hippie. I love trees. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. It's natural medicine. It's legal. It's safe. It's no more addictive than coffee. So I didn't see the risks, in it. I didn't see the dangers in it. I didn't see that there was any sort of negative thing that would come from taking this. I looked at it like it was an herbal supplement. And so I'll never forget the first time that I mixed up a dose of kratom, after I made the decision, okay, I'm going to try this stuff. It sounds cool. And I sourced it out online and I got it and I mixed it up. I remember famous last words. I remember talking to my husband at that time who was sitting in the same room as me. And I remember saying to him, like, what do I have to lose? This pain thing, like, just to give you also a little backstory, if this is your first video crossing paths with me, I had lost my dad and another close family member about a couple years, I think it was, before. And if you've ever lost somebody really close to you like that, you know the impact of grief, and how hard it is, and it just completely changes you and it completely turns your life upside down. And so I was contending with that too. And at that time I was having a hard time functioning with the pain thing, and then with this whole grief thing of like losing a parent and losing another super close family member. And so really it created the perfect storm so that when Kratom actually came into my life, it was the perfect recipe for me to, become addicted to it, basically. So I remember saying to my husband before I drank that swamp water that I just don't want to need anything else. Because at that point I had been a big pothead for forever at that point. I worked in the cannabis industry for a long time. Weed was one of those things that, like I said, as long as it wasn't processed and it was a plant, that I was down with it. And when I quit drinking, I looked at weed as like, it like helped me through quitting drinking. And I loved weed. I was passionate about weed. I worked with it. I consumed it. It was a big part of my identity. But I was helplessly addicted to it, and I needed weed the moment that I woke up in the morning, and I consumed it through the day until I went to bed. And I needed it. And I needed coffee to counteract that because I was so stoned that I needed the coffee to give me energy and stuff. So I needed those things. And I remember saying to my husband, I just don't want to need anything else. And I hope that this isn't like that. But at that point, I hadn't heard anything about it being addictive. So I took that first dose of Kratom. And I'll never forget it, you guys. I was, like I said, a couple years after losing my dad. And, the weight of that grief and the weight of that sadness and the weight of that like shock and denial was so heavy, and the weight of the stress of my life and the weight of the pain in my body was really difficult. And right when that Kratom kicked in, it was summertime, and I went out to work in my garden. And I remember it kicked in when I was working in my garden, and like I started to notice this shift. The Kratom was kicking in. I started to notice the weight being lifted. I started essentially what it was to feel that euphoric aspect that Kratom gives. And I remember that colors seemed more vivid. And I remember because it was early in the morning and there was still like the morning dew on the plants, and the sun was like shining just right on everything. And it was an incredible experience where I felt happy for the first time in a really long time at that point, because my dad had passed a couple years before, but he had a lifelong health condition that led up to his passing. And we knew that he didn't have much time towards the end. So leading up to him passing, I was going out to the East Coast regularly to be with him and to help with his end of life care and all of that kind of stuff. And so, and I also was working a stressful job at that time in the cannabis industry, where I would go and spend months away from home working on the West Coast, and then I would come back home. And so, and there was just stress in my family, like all of this kind of stuff was going on. And it was like everything melted away for a moment. And that was really amazing at that moment. But looking back on it, it was really scary when I now see it for what it was, because that was, like I referred to it as, the perfect recipe for me to then, when that feeling wore off, to then chase it for what would turn into the 3 years to come. Because I wasn't ready to deal with the death of my father. I wasn't ready to deal with the pain, the physical pain from my chronic pain condition, and the mess that my family had turned into at that time. And I wasn't ready to deal with any of that stuff. And what Kratom became was coping mechanism and basically like a self-medicating approach to these things that I couldn't deal with. And I'm now 40 years old, but at that time I was in my, early 30s, whatever the math is on that. And I've learned a lot since then. And I didn't know those things at that time. And so I didn't have the insight that I have now as to how dangerous this substance was. So needless to say, things moved on from there, and I went through what I call it as the honeymoon phase with Kratom, where it lasted for about a year, where Kratom was great for a year for me. But what really started the decline into ultimately one of the darkest parts of my life was that the thing with Kratom and the thing with any substance is that the more you take it, the higher your tolerance to it becomes. So the more that you need to take to try to feel anything that you felt in the beginning of using it. So what this translates into is that I was taking larger and larger doses the longer that I took Kratom. And Kratom has this weird way. It's not weird, it's just the nature of the substance. It's the nature of, just how it works in the body and such, that the larger the amount of Kratom that you take, the more of a sedative, depressant quality that it takes on. Whereas the smaller amounts are known to be in most people more uplifting, more euphoric. And also what happens with those larger doses is that there is a heavier, what's called a body load. And a body load with substances is basically like how much stress it's putting on your body, and then how that makes you feel is that it feels like, they call it a body load. It feels heavy. You're feeling these negative aspects of your body trying to process that amount of whatever substance it is. And really what that means is it pretty much makes you feel like crap if you take a large amount of it, especially if you take a large amount of it repeatedly. But at that point, after I was through the honeymoon phase of it, and I'm taking larger and larger amounts, just to let you know too, I was taking 60 to 80 grams per day at the highest amount of my Kratom addiction. So what that meant was I was taking 10 to 15 gram doses multiple times a day. And I'm not a big person. And during that time, especially, as the Kratom addiction went on, I started losing a lot of weight rapidly. So I'm not a big person, and I'm taking all of this Kratom. And things got really bad, and they got really dark really quickly in that second year. Because as my dosage increased, and as my then in turn weight went down, it was just a mess, to be honest with you. And the negative things that I experienced in that second year created basically a hell on earth for me. And I went through, along with the physical stuff, I went through mental hell, basically. And I'll start with the physical things. Like I said, I lost all this weight, and it wasn't just like, I lost like pounds. I also, like, my muscles atrophied. That's the right atrophied, whatever the word is, where it's like literally my muscles just like disintegrated. And this is because I wasn't eating anything. And so then for my body to try to sustain itself was consuming anything that it could, including, my fat was already long gone. So it started like my muscles literally just disintegrated. I then in turn, when you lose a bunch of weight and your body is stressed out like that, my hormones got all out of whack. I lost more than half of my hair. My skin became so dry because kratom is like tannic and super dehydrating, just naturally the way that it is. And taking that large amount of it, it dried me out so much that it didn't matter how much water I would drink. I was just so dry all the time. And so then my skin was so dry, and it wouldn't matter how much lotion, oils, whatever I would put on my skin. It was like my skin would just like suck it up. And so my skin was dry and flaky. I got these huge bags under my eyes, and my eyes were like just super dark and sunken in and hollow. Mentally, like I said, it was horrible. Like, being addicted to this substance. So this is it acts like an opiate in our brains. And so, as you know, it's no like secret that opiates are highly addictive, and also that the withdrawals are terrible. And so that's how kratom is. And when you talk about that mentally, it's horrible, because I would take the dose of kratom and it would last for maybe few hours if I was lucky. And then the withdrawals would start. And then it would be the same thing where I would have to take a dose of kratom, and it created this like perpetual cycle of taking the kratom. I was taking so much at that time, so I would oftentimes feel sick from kratom, and I would throw up and my eyes would like wiggle because of kratom toxicity, basically. And then, the high, or after a certain point, I wasn't even getting high anymore. It was just kind of taking away the withdrawals. And then that would wear off, and then I would have to take the kratom again. And so it was this cycle. And mentally, it was horrible, because I would go from, and in withdrawals, you're in this horrible state of anxiousness, panic attacks, catastrophic thinking. I developed, a lot of people in the thick of kratom addiction developed these crazy phobias that are completely unrooted in reality, but because of how our brains work when we are in the addiction, and like this cycle, this like negative feedback loop cycle that we get into while we're dosing with kratom and then coming off of it and going into withdrawals and then taking it again, it's really easy to become very irrational. So I developed a phobia of driving. I developed a phobia of people. I became pretty much agoraphobic at the end of my addiction. And so mentally, that's literally hell on earth. And my life around me is dissolving at this point. I couldn't even stand being around myself, let alone other people, and this greatly affected my relationships. I pushed away pretty much everybody in my life at that point, friends and family wise, and it became where I was completely isolated, and my husband works really long days, and so I was just alone. At that point, my work in the cannabis industry had ended, and I didn't know what I was going to do next career-wise. And so I was alone, and it was completely horrible. I was suffering physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, everything. And it was one of the darkest moments of my life. And at that point, I knew that at about the second year, I knew that it wasn't sustainable to do this. And at that point, I still didn't know that kratom was even addictive. And I knew that I needed it, but I thought, like, as everything's going on around me, I still thought that kratom wasn't the problem. And honestly, you guys, what it was, and I've talked about this on this channel and other videos before, what it was that started to kind of shine a tiny light into this darkness that I was in was that dude's channel, Psyched Substance, that I told you I had watched when I was watching stuff about kratom to begin with, made a video called I Was Wrong About Kratom or something to that nature. And I remember watching it and him going, because he was one of the ones that said that Kratom was harmless and that Kratom wasn't addictive. And this video was him talking about his experience with Kratom addiction and how it became addictive. And at that point I was like, oh no. Oh no. And then it just opened up my mind, basically, and my eyes to the fact that, okay, if this person that was advocating for Kratom is also addicted to Kratom, then this stuff is addictive, and I am addicted to it. And so at that point began the long, slow process of getting out of the addiction, because at that point I was in the second year, and I would say that was like right at the beginning of the second year for me. And that's as I got out of the honeymoon phase and I went into the depths of this addiction and everything started to just fall apart around me. I then saw that video, and I'll be straight up with you, I didn't even know how to quit at that point, and I wasn't even ready to begin thinking about it. So I then spent that next second year knowing that it was a problem and knowing that I needed to quit and not knowing how to do it. And I didn't even know how to begin thinking about it. So I went through that second year, and as I came into my third year, and mind you, I haven't had any, at that point, experience with being physically dependent on anything except for weed. And I still didn't think that weed was a problem at that point. I wasn't physically addicted to alcohol when I quit. I had a little run with nicotine and I just weaned myself off of it and it wasn't a problem. And so I had no experience with being physically addicted to anything on that level. And so I started, and at that point, other than that dude's video, I didn't know about the Quitting Kratom subreddit. I didn't know about any ways that I could actually quit. So I just started to slowly wean myself off of it. And I started a very slow taper process, which lasted a year. And that was the last year of my Kratom addiction, was that taper. And the more that I tapered, the better that I felt. And at the end, I came down to 4 1-gram doses per day. And you can see in my other videos, I chronicled in a very detailed way the phases of Kratom addiction recovery, I think is the name of the series here on our channel. But I go into a lot more detail about it there. But basically I just weaned myself off of it, and over the course of a year, over a very long taper. And then I made my final jump in February 18th of 2020 during the pandemic. And I went through the withdrawals. It was really tough. I went through a year of really gnarly pause. And then I came back to life again, thank God above. And this channel began when I was in the third year of my Kratom recovery last year, I think it was. And that's where we are now. Is over the past year, I have gone into my story and my experience on many different levels. And the purpose for this video, actually, and the series that this is going to be a part of, is that I made those first videos on this channel here when I was well into my recovery, but I was not cool or comfortable sitting down in front of the camera like I am now and just, chilling with you guys and rapping with you guys and just, sharing my experience in the way that I can now. So it's always been an intention of mine to recreate these videos in, the way that we relate to each other now. So in this series, I'm going to be redoing the videos in like a 2.0 kind of way, where I'm going to just be, sharing again what I went through and what it was like. And I hope that if you see this video and you're in Kratom addiction, that it will help you to realize that no matter how bad it has become or how far you're in, that there is hope to be free from this, and I am living proof, and that's the purpose of this channel, is to convey that message and to share it with you. So I hope that you stick around as we continue forward. And the next video, I'm going to talk about how I quit in more detail. So I hope to see you then, and I thank you for watching. Bye.